They truly aren't scared of them. It was commonly said that seeing was believing. Except that she wasn't sure whether it was right to believe what she saw. People were averse to the undead for a very good reason. It wasn't conducive to a long life to become comfortable with the things. Frianne watched in envy as Dimir went ahead of their group with Liane, running this way and that as she exclaimed her amazement over everything she came across. As much as she would have liked to express the same appreciation for what they saw, it was hardly appropriate for an imperial princess. "Oh," Dimir gushed, "the town has the same pavement as the highways." "Yep." Liane smiled. "But it looks so expensive. How can anyone afford to do this much?" "Hee, want it for your domain? We can cut you a special deal." "I do." "Oh, but I don't have my own domain yet. Just give me a few years." To be certain, the ride into the Sorceress Kingdom gave them much to admire, but all that seemed a small thing indeed now that they were walking through the bustling markets of Corlin Harbor. For Frianne's part, however, she couldn't help but continually glance at the undead. As they walked along, she did her best to stay as far away as possible from anything that she spotted, but they would sometimes appear out of the crowd to give her such a fright that she found herself clinging to Ludmilla's arm before she realized what had happened. The townsfolk didn't seem to care at all about the undead, however. Traffic flowed around the sentries and patrols as if they were no different than Imperial Knights. "Is Dimir still trying to join the diplomatic mission?" Clara asked. "She is," Frianne answered. "It's slow going, however. Not only is the court council being cautious about it, but they don't think a young woman should head the mission. Half because they think it's cruel to send her to the Sorceress Kingdom and half because they want an older, experienced man running things. Not that there are any volunteers for the post." "How is Dimir taking that?" "Oh, you know her. She's invincible when it comes to that kind of thing. Becoming an ambassador is an inevitability to her. At the slow rate that the Empire is coming to grips with the undead, she may be the first to do it." Even if a few nobles showed interest, the temples still strongly opposed their implementation into civilian industry. Bringing in the undead has proven far more difficult than it initially seemed. "Speaking of posts," Clara said, "did you receive any titles upon being appointed as head Imperial Court Mage?" "I did. I'm the Countess of Waldenstein now. It's a territory in the forest northeast of our winter. Even though it's in the Imperial heartland, it's not a very impressive place. The forest was a part of the Imperial family's hunting grounds. A king's wood, so to speak." "Congratulations nonetheless, Countess Waldenstein," Clara smiled. "You never mentioned these things in your letters. Does that mean you'll be bringing back some friends from the Sorceress Kingdom?" "Honestly, I'm still undecided. I suppose that's why I'm here." "How long did it take for your citizens to return to, resume their everyday routines?" She couldn't say return to normal because what she witnessed couldn't be considered normal at all. "That depended on a variety of factors," Clara said. "Ludmilla's domain recovered and surpassed its former state less than a month after the official annexation." "Clara is framing what happened in the most generous of terms," Ludmilla said. "My fief was practically abandoned by the time I went to pay my respects to the new government in Erantle. It didn't take much effort on my part to have it surpass its former state." "But new settlers still came to your territory, yes?" Frianne said. "I'd like to know how you got them used to undead. Our progress in the northwestern frontier and the Wyvernmark is a crawl, at best. Integration on the military end of things was swift, but we continue to face stiff resistance from the temples and the civilian aristocracy to this day." "You will never bring the faith of the Four to your side," Clara told her. "The root of their resistance is not economic or cultural, but religious." Frianne sighed. She suspected as much. The Baharuth Empire's struggle with the faith of the Four far preceded the advent of the Sorcerer's Kingdom. As a secular government, the imperial administration was relentless in its quest to assert total authority over the citizens of the empire, but the temples were steadfast in their resistance against anything that they saw as immoral, evil, or detrimental to the spiritual health of the citizenry and made sure the people knew about it. Unlike the aristocratic establishment, the temples couldn't be undermined by legislation, propaganda, or physical force. Pushing them too hard would plunge the empire into domestic chaos, as they had just as much, if not more, political clout over the people than the imperial throne. The fact that they usually didn't resort to violent methods made them that much harder to get rid of. Even if the empire could get rid of them, It would implode shortly after because the temples safeguarded the physical health of the country. Thus, the only way to deal with the temples was through often fruitless negotiation. The temples would never endorse the undead as a matter of faith, and so they had come to an impasse. What happened to the temples of the four in Irantal? Frian asked. They are still around, Clara answered with a shrug. And they are every bit as obstinate as their counterparts in the Empire. Then how does the Sorceress Kingdom deal with them? They don't. Matters of religion have nothing to do with the government. So long as the law is observed, people are free to practice their respective faiths. If only we had the luxury of taking a similar stance. What would happen if you did? Ludmilla asked. Frian fell silent for several moments to ponder the question. It wasn't an avenue that the Imperial administration would ever consider. I'm not certain, she said. The relationship between the Imperial administration and the temples is akin to a struggle for ideological dominance. If we do not make a continuous effort to counter religious propaganda with government propaganda, I suspect that we may wake up one day to find the Empire transformed into a de facto theocracy. How come that hasn't happened to Riestais? Institutionally speaking, their government is weak. I believe it has to do with the kingdom's decentralized nature, Frian replied. Ironically, the strength of the temples in the Empire is directly linked to the success of the Empire as an increasingly centralized regime. The temples do not hold any land as they do in the theocracy and the Holy Kingdom, and they similarly have no say in the governance of the realm. Thus, their strength waxes and wanes according to the strength and stability of the Empire. In Riestais, the fabric of society is very local in its scope. You have, on paper, extremely powerful aristocrats ruling over what is effectively a collection of thousands of petty kingdoms, clans, and tribes. Any friction that occurs between the temples and the government happens on that same, local level. It is to the degree that I wouldn't be surprised if the faith of the four in Riestais differs in character depending on what region of the country one is in. She nearly bumped into Dimuia as she spoke. The bespectacled young woman had stopped in her tracks, staring wide-eyed at something ahead of them. What's wrong? Look at there, Prez. Dimuia pointed. Frian frowned, wondering what had caused the noblewoman to cease speaking properly. When she figured out what she was pointing at, she didn't think she could speak properly herself. A small column of men, women, and children came in the opposite direction. Each was fully armed and armored, cloaked in black temple vestments with silver trim. Despite the friendly look that the members of the column sported, Frian involuntarily shuddered. Nothing will come out, Ludmilla said, no matter how hard you squeeze me. Frian released the taller noblewoman. Those are adherents of Sursana, aren't they? They are, Ludmilla replied. I suppose a realm ruled by the undead would be teeming with death worshippers. As the column passed, one of the men noticed them standing there. He smiled and waved and soon the entire group was doing the same. Clara and Ludmilla returned their greeting. Like the rest of the townsfolk, they treated the undead no differently than they would human soldiers. Hey, Dimuia, Leanne said. Yeah? I have a thing to show you. A thing? Really? Let's go. What are they doing? Frian asked after the black-garbed column disappeared behind the crowd. If you meant the temple staff, Clara said, they are going on a field trip. I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that term. Ah, my apologies. There are probably hundreds of terms we've picked up from His Majesty, his court, the royal household, and the new administration. A field trip is essentially a journey that apprentices go on for vocational experience. In that case, where were they going? There are two parts to their field trips. The first is helping out with the rural ministry in one of Calling County's constituent baronies. The second is combat training in the Katza Plains. See combat training. Frian's eyebrows rose in alarm. There were children in that group, weren't there? Many of them couldn't have been older than 10. Well, they are squires and acolytes. It's to be expected, yes? Frian glanced at Ludmilla. She didn't seem to have any problem with what Clara said and neither did their maids. Leanne was already long gone with Dimuia again. Life in the Sorceress Kingdom had been described in mostly unassuming terms when they visited the Empire. Now that she was here, she found that everything she had heard was technically correct, but also fell woefully short of imparting the reality of things. Reports from Imperial intelligence could scarcely be believed by anyone who read them. That's right, I'm here to investigate things for myself. Even if I'm among friends, I can't just let the day go by gawking at everything. I'd like to go back to what I originally asked about, Freyan said. What else factored into the rapid adoption of the Sorceress Kingdom's new methods, Ludmilla? Once again, the taller noblewoman replied, the progress achieved in my domain was framed in the most generous of terms. I met with little resistance because I was the sole occupant of the territory when I started. My tenants fled to the theocracy, fearing what would happen after we learned what happened in the Battle of Katza Plains. Even I was swept up by the overall sentiment in the village. By the time I snapped out of it, it was too late to do anything. As the remaining member of House Saradnik in Warden's Vale, I should have understood that the outcome of the battle meant a drastic shift in Erantl's political situation. My responsibility was to find out what it meant for the land and its people. In the end, His Majesty had to send someone to retrieve me, and I was the last noble in the entire duchy to learn what had happened. Ludmilla's cheeks colored slightly while she spoke, as if she was still mortified over those events. Freyan, however, couldn't blame her or her people for acting the way that they did. They were dealing with the undead, after all. Half of the duchy's population fled, Clara said. My entire county is made up of the titles that the southern nobles abandoned out of that same fear. That doesn't make my actions excusable, Ludmilla replied. I'm a frontier noble and my tenants were frontiersmen descended from families that defended the border for generations. The first line of defense isn't supposed to flee at the first sign of danger. I still can't figure out where everyone went, so they may not have stopped running for all I know. Is that why you adopted the new ways so quickly? Freyan asked, because you're expected to be invulnerable or something? No. It was because of my new liege. Lady Shaltir personally took the time to set me on the right path. I would be the most reprehensible of ingrates if I hadn't put in the requisite effort to reciprocate her. Freyan idly wondered what a noble from the Sorcerer King's side was like. The Prime Minister of the Sorceress Kingdom was reportedly an in-the-flesh demon and Jerkniv always referred to the Sorcerer King and his inner circle as monsters, but it was difficult to imagine monsters acting in ways that humans could understand. Ludmilla's account made them seem much more personable. Then what about your subjects? I can't imagine they received the same treatment. They did, Ludmilla replied. They did? Freyan frowned. I said as much, didn't I? Ludmilla told her, I put in the requisite effort to reciprocate my liege. Just as she took the time and effort to ensure I had everything that I needed to succeed, so, too, did I do the same for my tenants. A chivalrous woman, huh? True chivalry was rare in the Empire, as the Imperial administration went to great lengths to eliminate it. Chivalry strengthened the bonds between liege and vassal and thus interfered with imperial policies that demanded absolute fealty to the Emperor. What the Empire desired was loyal, productive citizens who adhered to the laws and standards set forth by the central bureaucracy, not ties created through personal relationships and common culture. Now that I think about it, Ludmilla said, shouldn't it be the same for the Imperial Knights? They share a roughly similar background and the titles granted to newly promoted Imperial Knights are mostly created through Imperial expansion, effectively making them frontier nobles. I can see how you'd think that might be the case, Freyan said, but there are vast differences, especially with Imperial Knights raised in the last 2 generations. The older houses should be as you say, however. What are those vast differences? Ludmilla asked. Foremost would be the fact that most don't personally administer their territories. The vast majority of Imperial Knights come from common backgrounds, after all. They neither have the education nor experience to do so. But their children inherit the title, don't they? You mentioned the last 2 generations. I did, Freyan nodded. It's a relatively new initiative introduced by the Emperor before the last. Since a good Imperial Knight does not necessarily become a good administrator, they rarely do, the Empire saw fit to provide senescals for them. The senescals are graduates from the Imperial Magic Academy and most of them are spares from the civilian aristocracy. In all, I believe it's an elegant arrangement that benefits all involved. I assume that the children of those senescals go on to attend the Imperial Magic Academy, Clara said. Yes, that's right, Freyan replied. It serves to incentivize performance. The senescals will put their education to good use if they wish to ensure a livelihood and future for their families. Clara and Ludmilla exchanged a silent look. Freyan glanced back and forth between them. Did I say something strange? Frian asked. No, Ludmilla answered. What you described is characteristic of the Baharuth Empire. Is there something wrong with that? As far as short-term solutions go, Clara said, it's well suited to the Empire's institutional framework. As you mentioned, it's an elegant arrangement that uses what the Empire has on hand. And for the long term? I can immediately see that it will create a militant culture with a ravenous appetite for conquest, Ludmilla said. The Imperial Knights will raise their children to be Imperial Knights, while the Senescals managing their territories will raise their children to be Senescals themselves. This will result in a political faction that sees conquest as the way to secure a future for their families, and that faction will grow with every new conquest. The Imperial Army will go from its traditionally defensive stance to an overwhelmingly offensive one. Is that what the Empire desires? I believe you know the answer to that already, Frian replied. The Empire was chipping away at Reistais all these years before the appearance of the Sorceress Kingdom, after all. And the Empire was offered a sampling of what it will be like now that you don't have a Reistais to chip away at, Ludmilla told her. To be certain, the capabilities and sheer inertia of the Imperial Army, along with the industrial might behind it, will facilitate the rapid expansion of the Imperial frontier, but the world is an unforgiving place for those who don't follow its rules. There will be the domestic ramifications, as well, Clara added. As Ludmilla mentioned, this will result in the creation of a class of, well, let's call them imperialists who are distinct from the martial elite that you're familiar with. Since imperial culture idolizes success, they're bound to be tremendously influential at all levels of society. They will be seen as harbingers of a new era of prestige and prosperity for the Empire, and the Empire will be reshaped in their image. At least until a dragon eats them, Ludmilla said. Jokes aside. It wasn't a joke. Clara cleared her throat. The realities of that future still stand. What does the Empire plan on doing about it? Conceptually speaking, Frian said, the Court Council is well aware of what may happen. We plan on adapting our current methods as the situation demands. Rest assured, the Emperor has every intention of keeping things firmly in hand. I wasn't referring to the new faction that would arise, Clara said, or anything the Empire would recognize as a faction at all. I was asking about this. With a sweeping gesture, Clara indicated the crowded plaza before them. What of the people, Frian? She said, a period of drastic change is coming to the Baharuth Empire, yet it seems that the situation of its citizens will stay the same. You said that the Imperial Court Council plans on adapting its current methods as the situation demands. That means that the Empire is content with how things currently are with the common folk, yes? Is there something wrong with encouraging the people to strive for excellence and earn the acclaim of their peers? Earlier, you mentioned that many important aspects of the Empire had been left behind or damaged severely. I must wonder what you meant by that, given your apparent stance. I thought we were on the same page back when I mentioned this during our time together in our winter, but... Frian took in the activity of the market and its surrounding shops. The scenes around them wouldn't be out of place in the markets of our winter's second-class district. Aside from the presence of the undead, of course. Do you mean to say that things are done differently here, Clara? She asked. I'm not the only person who does things differently, Clara answered. Take the temples, for instance. Clara stopped to indicate a set of buildings that Frian had been trying very hard not to look at. On the western end of the plaza was a huge complex that must have occupied as much space as the Imperial Palace and the complex upon its grounds. It was rather spare in its presentation, but the trappings of the temple staff made it plain that it was an institute of the 6 great gods. For some reason, the undead sentries were placed at regular intervals there, too. Are the undead allowed to be that close to a temple? They're supposed to be holy sites. The temples, neither those of the 6 or the 4, do not discriminate in the way that the Empire does, Clara told her. Those who seek to become a man or woman of the cloth or wish to join the faith militant are provided the same opportunity as anyone else. The Imperial administration is much the same, Frian said. That's clearly not true, Clara told her. Children are taken in as acolytes and squires and taught everything they need to know to become a cleric, paladin, or priest. Can you claim that the Empire does the same for its bureaucrats? In a way, it does, Frian replied. The empire's nobles manage titles granted to them by the empire, and through the incomes and experience from managing those titles, they facilitate the education of their children. Those children then go on to attend the Imperial Magic Academy, where every student is held to the same standard. That only underscores what I'm trying to say. The temples take anyone and provide them with room, board, and tuition. The Imperial Magic Academy has entrance requirements that essentially bar more than 99% of the population from attending. It makes exceptions for those of talent who wouldn't otherwise be able to attend. The empire espouses meritocratic ideals, but it exists in a state that is far from them. Not unless you consider wealth and privilege merits in their own right. If there is no equity in education, then there is no equity of opportunity. A farmer will always be a farmer unless they are sent to the local town or city as a spare, and it is very rare indeed that a spare finds success in the empire. The empire holds itself above the other human countries in the region, but the reality is that it's not much different when it comes to the disparity between its social strata. You have the martial elite, the administrative elite, the clergy, and then there's everyone else. Nothing is being done about the systems of education and vocational association that entrap everyone in their respective worlds. Worlds may be a bit of an exaggeration. I don't think it's an exaggeration at all, Clara said. The conceptual and philosophical framework through which a noble, merchant, and farmer interpret the world around them are so far removed from one another that it may as well be to bring all of those worlds together. The root cause of that division must be addressed. Frianne eyed the temple complex warily as they turned and walked by. It looked menacing just by existing. Quite frankly, she said, I believe what you're suggesting is impossible. This alignment of worlds you're proposing would bankrupt the empire before it got anywhere with it. Are you implying that you've achieved it in your county? Not entirely, Clara said, but we are taking decisive steps toward implementing standardized universal education. Ludmilla is the only one that has managed to get there so far. It was a short-term achievement, Ludmilla said. I have thousands of goblins to educate now. Ogres, trolls, and several other demi-human races, as well. Is there a point to educating goblins? The little green demi-humans were notoriously stupid, so it felt like Ludmilla was embarking on a futile venture. What would she even do with them if she did? Leanne and Dimia reappeared when they turned the next corner and headed back east along the north side of the plaza. Frianne frowned at an odd piece of paper stuck to Dimia's forehead. There's something up here, Dimia, Frianne pointed at her forehead. We went to the vampires, Prez. Dimia's glasses gleamed in the sunlight. The vampires? The post office, Leanne threw her thumb over her shoulder. Each of the major branches is staffed by at least one vampire. There are 3 in this one. Frianne looked past the 2 noblewomen to the storefront behind them. What appeared to be an envelope with bat wings sealed by a pink heart was carved into the sign above its open door. This is a postage stamp. Dimia looked up cross-eyed at her forehead. It's supposed to pay the fee for delivering parcels. I tried mailing myself back to our winter, but the vampire lady at the front desk said that they didn't offer that service yet. Why would you mail yourself back to our winter? Frianne asked. It seemed like a good idea at the time, Dimia answered. The rates are super cheap. They said it'd only take 3 hours, too. Totally worth it. What if they actually did deliver you to our winter? There's a vampire post office there, too. I didn't know that. Did you know that? I didn't. The office is in the Imperial Army's aviary, Leanne said. They wouldn't let us put it anywhere else. For obvious reasons. If people discovered that there were vampires in our winter, the city would lose all of its commercial traffic. We are going back already? Leanne asked. We are going to the Eastern Plaza, Clara answered. I don't want to go to school. We were just discussing education, Clara said, so paying a visit would be educational. You have a school in this town? Frianne asked. 2 schools, Clara answered. The temple complex we just walked by has a large temple school and dormitories for its regular staff and initiates. The other school is for the townsfolk in general. I suppose you could say that it provides a secular education. Emulating the temples was absolutely out of the question for a proper imperial education, but the other school sounded like it might show her some useful things. Is that so? Frianne said, then I'm most curious to find out how your system differs from ours. I didn't pay any mind to this before, Frian said, but isn't this town too big to be called a town? When compared to the towns that one usually sees in the region, yes. Clara's reply was so nonchalant that Frian nodded absently for a second before forcefully stopping herself. It didn't take long to see that Corlin Harbor was far from a normal town, but the fact that its residents didn't appear to treat it as anything special made her question her own sanity. Perhaps the trick lay in how conventional any one part of the town was. A plaza full of stands, a guild office, a row of workshops along the street, every component of the urban landscape was familiar. As Frian saw more and more of the place, however, she steadily came to understand that it was far more than the sum of its parts. What she still couldn't grasp was the full extent of that whole and how it came together. At the same time, something deep within her understood. Everything that she saw felt intuitively correct, and that was the part that probably unsettled her the most. She felt that she could never get lost. She knew where everything was roughly supposed to be, to the point where she could guess what was around the corner even though she had never been there before. Above all else, there was a sense of safety and harmony shared by everyone around her. Is it some sort of enchantment laid over the entire area? I've never heard of the like, if so. Just before they reached the town's palatial administrative center, Clara brought them north to follow a lane up into one of the residential districts. Frian turned around at the gatehouse atop the incline to look out over the town's center. Everything feels so idyllic, she said. But I don't understand why. Did you grow up in our winter? Clara asked. I was born and raised in the Imperial Center, Frian answered with a nod. But, compared to here, everything there feels so cold, sterile, distant. She finally pinned down the feeling that she got from the place. It was similar to the villages her group passed through during their promotional examination. I see, Frian murmured. The residents of Corlin Harbor aren't urbanites. Not only do they behave differently from city folk, but the town is designed to accommodate that behavior. That didn't take long at all, Clara smiled slightly. Frian turned back around and they resumed walking. The town was recently chartered, Frian said, and the residents are spares that came in from the surroundings. But that can't explain everything. It doesn't, Clara said, but it made for an excellent foundation to build on. In our day and age, where towns and cities are well past the dates of their founding, certain expectations and modes of thought have been established. Rather than blindly emulate them, I took the opportunity to avoid what I consider mistakes. And what do you consider mistakes? Anything that results in unnecessary stratification, to begin with. That's one of the defining traits of towns and cities, isn't it? They are concentrations of wealth generated by the surrounding territories and their resulting commerce, yet, at the same time, they are where the greatest disparity of wealth is experienced. Our winter is probably the greatest example of that in the region. The city's districts categorize people by their means and dictate the quality of life that one is allowed to enjoy. The residents of the first-class district possess more wealth than the rest of the city combined 100,000 times over. They live in palatial estates, receive the attention of 90% of the city's security, and have priority access to all of the amenities and luxuries they need and desire. The average resident of one of the fourth-class districts, on the other hand, must share a rundown, 20-square-meter apartment with their entire family, receive no attention at all from city security, only have access to the lowest quality food, can't even secure a stable daily wage, and can't afford basic health care from the temples. I fear to imagine what would happen if a fire broke out, and I am compelled to ask what merits these people possess to deserve their state of squalor. That's hardly a fair question to pose to me, Frian said. It was already like that over a century before I was born. Things are literally set in stone. Does that mean you are forever beholden to the past? Clara asked. Will it mean that more winters will be created in the future? How long will the Empire last if it insists on fashioning its future out of the errors of the past? Change will not come easily, Frian said. You are talking about a culture with over 8 million people's worth of inertia behind it. Governance isn't known for being easy. Those in power who believe that it is are doing something wrong. There will be many opportunities to bring about change. If you wait for them to present themselves before you start, however, it will most likely be too late. That much, at least, was one of the fundamentals of good rule. It could be applied to most things, for that matter. The problem was that governance was 9 parts maintenance and 1 part leadership. Leading in the way that Clara described involved competing for scarce resources that were usually prioritized for the former. This may be so, Frian said, but it entails joining the 100-way battle between the institutions of the Empire. Even as the head Imperial Court Mage, I've only been able to increase the Imperial Ministry of Magic's budget by making common cause with other Imperial factions. Then why not employ the same tactics? Clara asked. Because I've only succeeded once, Frian answered. I proposed the expansion of the Imperial Army's Corps of Engineers, specifically the recruitment and training of more mages, which the Imperial Army was all too happy to support. It wasn't hard convincing everyone else, as there is a huge backlog of public works projects as well as a need for increased engineering capacity with the unprecedented expansion of the Imperial frontier. Addressing cultural and economic issues that no one considers issues, indeed the administration considers them favorable, will be seen as nothing more than a waste of the Court Council's time. But there are allies for said cultural and economic issues, yes? There are? The High Lords of the Imperial Court Council itself, Clara told her. Specifically the members of the civilian aristocracy. Frian's frown grew dire at the implications of Clara's suggestion. That would be a good way to get my head removed from my shoulders, Frian said. My cousin has spent the last decade stripping the aristocratic establishment of its power and influence. What you propose would be doing the exact opposite. If anything, the Emperor would consider it a betrayal. All of House Gershmund might be purged for it. Are the accounts of the Emperor's genius little more than imperial propaganda? No, Frian replied, but my cousin is a product of his circumstances. He is accustomed to being in control and suffers no challenges to that control. Additionally, he is more than a bit single-minded when it comes to achieving his objectives, pursuing them to the detriment of everything else. He himself knows this, yet he simply accepts it for what it is. Then let us see how we can align our objectives to his, shall we? I can't imagine that you haven't considered it, but we may be able to open new avenues for you. Logically speaking, it was the best and only way. The Emperor was extraordinarily shrewd, however. Swaying him wasn't so simple as saying so. I bet if we convince Lady Albedo to deliver a vaguely worded suggestion, Leanne said, every proposal would just fly through after that. Except that it wouldn't get us any closer to our long-term goals, Clara told her. Being arbitrary doesn't ensure that any measures enacted will be sustainable for the long term. As they walked along, pedestrians bobbed their heads in greeting. They undoubtedly knew who Clara was, yet there was no semblance of formality beyond that. Frian watched the people and their surroundings carefully, but all she could figure out was that the town had stopped looking like a town. If anything, it looked more like a vast field where clusters of houses were built around newly planted copses and windbreaks. She looked around to see whether they had left the town without her realizing it, but it barely took her a moment to spot Corlin Harbour's second, larger wall with its banners fluttering in the wind. What sort of residential district is this? Frian asked. It looks more like a collection of rural villages than a proper set of city blocks. You are not wrong, Clara answered, but the area looks like a collection of villages because of the effect I'm trying to achieve rather than purposely constructing villages within the town's limits. It's related to what I mentioned about fixing the problems that I've noted with cities. One of the features that seemingly comes hand in hand with a high degree of economic and social stratification is that people feel the need to build walls. Walls? As in the security that one finds in our winter's first and second-class districts? Yes and no. Urbanites put up walls seemingly as a matter of course. For the most part, it's due to the notion that they must protect themselves against their fellow citizens. And that's wrong? It's natural to desire security and a degree of privacy, Clara said. But, somewhere in the transition to city life, people seem to lose their sense of it. Threats become larger than they are in reality and may not even exist at all. A shadow falls over one's thinking, making the world a lonelier, more callous place. Cities and towns are far more populous, Frian noted. Statistically speaking, attempting to live as one would in a village is guaranteed to see one assaulted or robbed at some point. Corlin Harbour hasn't had a single assault or robbery since its founding, Clara told her. Neither has Warden's Vale. One might argue that the presence of the undead is an extreme deterrent, but petty crime isn't completely unknown in Erantle or the other towns in the duchy. Then what do you propose the true problem is? Clara stopped to stand on the grass at the side of the road, watching one of the village-like collections of homes. The homes themselves were quite large, roughly the same size as a wealthy merchant's home in the second-class district of our winter. It was late in the afternoon, and many homemakers were out in their shed yards, chatting amicably with their neighbors while making preparations for the evening. A combination of issues, Clara replied. What I consider the most grave are the ones that develop over time. Humans number among the races that aren't mysteriously born with specific knowledge, nor do they possess the internal logic of elementals, undead, or other creatures of a highly magical nature. I understand that some may take offense at the comparison, but we are something like beasts. Humans possess higher intelligence than a cow or a wolf, but that intelligence turns into something like a curse as we innovate and advance our civilization. How so? Our bestial selves do not advance along with our civilization. Without protocols to reconcile what one experiences with one's nature, one becomes increasingly lost and reverts to savage interpretations of the world. But the imperial administration does attempt to guide its citizens away from acting according to their base instincts, Frian said. Yes, but those attempts fall woefully short because they are structured around the needs of the empire as an economic and political entity rather than as a society. The empire creates criminal laws and legal regulations in order to achieve the desired objectives of the imperial administration, leaving everything else to chance. The only tools that the empire employs are the honey and the whip. It is a reductive and highly inefficient methodology symptomatic of a society that doesn't understand itself. You have stopped thinking in the mistaken belief that you know everything. Frian gestured to the cluster of homes and their residents. Then how is this superior to conventional urban design? It combats the tendency for conventional urban design to inadvertently create the other, Clara replied. Humans are both social and territorial. In an urban setting, one's contributions to society usually don't involve the direct production of critical resources or territorial security. Yet, we continue to behave as if it is still the case. The wealthy create territories in the form of estates or higher-end residences and pay for as much security as they think they need. Everyone else is restricted to the homes that they can afford. Those homes take the place of territory and they do what they can to secure it. This results in the walls that I refer to. I'm not saying that one cannot have their own home. What is important is that the subconscious behavior and thought processes that are initiated as a result lead to mounting social issues. Physical boundaries facilitate the creation of social boundaries, and those, in turn, lead to behaviors inherent to human nature that are not conducive to an advanced civilization. We humans instinctively recognize threats first and prioritize addressing them as a matter of survival. If a home in the city becomes a territory, the threat becomes everyone that an individual doesn't recognize as part of their tribe. Residents in the first and second class districts of our winter naturally see the residents of the third and fourth class districts of the city as threats to their safety and wealth even when they usually aren't. Residents of the third and fourth class districts of the city see those in the same situation as themselves as competitors, and when those competitors exist outside of the tribe, they become potential enemies. Social isolation leaves one trapped in a cage of their own fears and preconceptions. Bad news travels more quickly than good and outweighs it by far. News of a murder in our winter will reach the ears of the citizens, but the fact that everyone else went about their usual business without being killed does not register. As time goes on, this sort of thing gives rise to a culture of paranoia that creates the very issues that it fears. The terrible situation that people imagine themselves to be in becomes the new normal, and that normal informs their behavior. The resulting society becomes highly vulnerable to demagoguery, misinformation, and propaganda because it is no longer grounded by reality. Frian considered Clara's words. It was easy for people to identify problems and blame them for one thing or the other, and doing so was something of a collective pastime in the imperial administration. Most of the time, however, such discussion led nowhere. Ideas were cheap, after all. So what you're doing with this residential district seeks to counter what you described, Frian said. Since most of my people are already close to where they should be behaviorally, Clara said. You could say that it instead reinforces the desired status quo. Those most at risk are the artisans living in the town center's shophouses. Making sure the people that they interact with spread the attitudes of a highly connected and tightly knit community that knows its members has the effect of balancing things out. Of course, any urbanites that move in from elsewhere will have their customary insular nature quickly eroded away. And if a crime occurs anyway, then it occurs, Clara shrugged. It is better than planting the seeds for 100,000 crimes in an effort to mitigate the effects of one. Somehow, Freyan muttered, I don't think the urbanites of the Empire would be amenable to this sort of layout. I'm sure the poor majority would appreciate it, Clara said. Oh, speaking of which, Corlin Harbor's districts are not divided by economic strata. The vast majority live in this same residential district you see before you, where the living standards are roughly uniform. The remainder are shop owners living above their stores and workshops with their families. If I'm not mistaken, Freyan said, a certain countess dwells in a palace on a ludicrously fortified island. My people see me often enough, Clara replied with a smile. Plus, you should understand that there are certain aspects of a ruler's image that are better maintained with a bit of distance. In other words, Ludmilla said, if her subjects saw the slovenly private life she leads, the radiant jewel of the Riverlands would lose all of its luster and Corlin Harbor would fall to anarchy. Clara swatted her friend so quickly that Freyan couldn't quite follow the attack. Ludmilla, for her part, didn't even flinch. It's not slovenly, Clara pouted. It's comfy. Do you agree with Clara, Ludmilla? Freyan asked. I believe that what she's said so far is generally sound, Ludmilla answered. She neglects to mention some important things, however. Such as? Humans are not the only race that is subject to what she described. Any race with a social component to their nature can fall victim to the same or similar issues, even undead beings like vampires. In their own respective ways, of course. Freyan scanned the surroundings looking for any sign of demi-humans. The resident population is almost entirely human here, Clara said. We are trying to avoid incidents with visitors from the theocracy, particularly when it comes to demi-humans. The only demi-human population in the area is the Harpy colony living on the south side of the island, which most people cannot reach. I see. Additionally, Ludmilla said, Clara hasn't mentioned all of the little details that go into maintaining and advancing the social system she oversees here. I was getting to that, Clara said. We'll be going around and back down to the Eastern Plaza where the public school is. What about the Foresters? Ludmilla asked. Clara rolled her eyes. Of course you would bring up the Foresters. The grass doesn't grow itself, you know. I've never once said that. Ludmilla's lips turned down ever so slightly. This town has Foresters? Freyan asked. Maintaining an environment that residents find pleasant is the product of persistent effort, Ludmilla said. Most cities I've been to are in such a terrible state that I'm fairly certain that the residents go through their entire lives never realizing that grass is supposed to be green. They even cry when they see what the world is supposed to look like. It's not that bad, Clara said. Every boatful of migrants to Wardensvale does that. So you're saying that this entire town has groundskeepers? Freyan asked. Ludmilla snorted. They are so much more than mere groundskeepers. The Foresters in Corlin Harbor are fully fledged rangers recruited from around Corlin County. As a whole, they serve a similar role to their rural counterparts, creating and maintaining a healthy urban environment. Urban rangers, so to speak. Were rangers so easy to find? As far as Freyan understood it, the Imperial Army struggled to find even one in each town and city and had to train the rest from scratch. What does that entail, exactly? Ludmilla often forgets that most humans don't speak Ranger, Clara said. Functionally speaking, they are responsible for the condition of the fledgling forest you see planted in the residential district, much like they would be responsible for managing productive woodland in rural territories. Additionally, they monitor soil and water quality, ensure that sanitation is efficient and non-hazardous, and keep up the overall appearance of the district. They also raise a selection of livestock suited for the space, such as fowl, goats, and fish stocked in the ponds and streams. When possible, Ludmilla added, we'd like to employ druids and incorporate their talents and magic into the town's management, as well. Freyan boggled over the implementation of rangers into the town. As far as she understood things, rangers were warriors with a kinship to nature that preferred to stay away from developed lands. What they were doing in Corlin Harbor was something like turning the city into the wilderness, and she wasn't sure if that made any sense. It certainly defied every convention of land utilization that she knew of. She could almost hear the screeching of the bureaucrats back at home if she decided to relate her findings with them. Never mind that. Independent rangers and druids in general were considered pests by the Empire because they constantly opposed, oftentimes violently, imperial expansion. The Empire hired workers to get rid of them more often than they employed them as adventurers. I don't think this will work in the Empire, Frian said. The Empire's developmental paradigms run entirely on state-approved metrics. The Imperial administration will always favor measurable efficiency over aesthetics and vague, holistic notions. That's unfortunate, Ludmilla said. For the Empire, that is. In that case, Clara hurriedly moved the discussion forward. We'll just have to wait until there are some numbers to present. The data may take the better part of a decade to collect and analyze, however. As you may have surmised, Corlin Harbor is something like a laboratory filled with experiments in urban planning and cultural engineering. The Sorceress Kingdom is far more open to such things than the Empire. That was one thing that didn't make much sense. Based on the Court Council's long-distance interactions with Prime Minister Albedo, Frian was certain that she was similar to the Emperor in terms of cold, calculating practicality. It was hard to imagine that she would be open to much of what was happening in Corlin Harbor. Is it because they can easily afford to experiment? No, that can't be right. There must be something else going on here, something like unprecedented knowledge or a blind spot for those raised in imperial culture. If the Empire isn't willing to rock the boat, so to speak, Ludmilla said, why not spearhead a project in a place where they won't mind? I'm uncertain where that might be, Frian replied. The Empire is preparing to rapidly expand its frontier. You'll have any number of new settlements to choose from. How much did she know? No, it would be strange for the Sorceress Kingdom to not know what its client state was up to. Especially since it was a colossal strategic effort that was hard to miss for those with access to the relevant information. What she still couldn't figure out was how much information Ludmilla had access to. She had served as a liaison officer to 2 Imperial Army groups, but that role may not have ended with the end of the 6th Army Group's brief campaign in the south. What's taken so long? Lian and Dimir appeared from one of the villages, munching on what looked like sandwiches. You are one of the wealthiest nobles in the Sorceress Kingdom, Ludmilla said. Must you eat other people's dinners? Hey, they invited us over. It's supposed to be all warm and fuzzy here, isn't it? Ludmilla peered at Lian, who moved to use Dimir as a shield. She's right, though, Dimir said. Everyone's so friendly here. I couldn't help but think they were trying to sell me something, but then I just got free stuff. If it's like this everywhere in the Sorceress Kingdom, I'm going to really hound the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to hurry up with that ambassadorial post. It's not, unfortunately, Clara replied. Not yet, at least. In terms of citizen attitudes, most of the duchy north of here is still similar to what one would normally experience in Riastais or the Empire. At least it's not like Ludmilla's territory, Lian said. They're constantly at war with one another down there. War? It's a specific area within my territory, Ludmilla said. The upper reaches of the Katsa River is a special administrative zone where the cultural practices of the natives aren't interfered with. This includes seasonal activities such as warfare. It's nothing extravagant, of course, just threat displays, raids, and contests between champions for the purposes of securing choice territories or enforcing existing borders. That's, really different from here, Dimir said. On the contrary, Ludmilla replied. Both my and Clara's territories pursue the same objectives, and the peoples of the upper reaches are surprisingly uniform, culturally speaking. I can show you around if you'd like. No, it's fine. I'll take your word for it. Try as she might, Frian was just as confused as Dimir looked about Ludmilla's assertions. With dinner being prepared all across the residential district, their party was accosted by a seemingly endless obstacle course of its denizens. Fortunately, they didn't expect her to eat 1,000 meals in a row. The locals happily chatted with everyone, not just Clara. It was an odd experience for Frian. Not even when she was a student at the Imperial Magic Academy would random people so casually approach her. By the time they escaped from the residential district, twilight had already fallen on Corlin Harbor. Unlike most towns, ample magical lighting illuminated the streets and the activity of the markets only seemed amplified compared to the day. They slowly made their way through the crowds, walking along the edge of the Eastern Plaza as the energy of the place washed over them. I hear a lot of theocracy accents, Freyan said. Merchants and travelers from the theocracy won't come close to Erantle, Clara told her, so call in Harbor as their main market in the Sorcerer's Kingdom. After that, they head straight to the Empire or Easties. Since nearly everyone here worships the 6 great gods, they treat it as they would the theocracy's portion of the Riverlands. Is it much different? Freyan asked. They're part of the Riverlands, I mean. There are certain differences, Clara said, but the industries and customs are practically the same. At least when it comes to interactions between humans. Clara turned away from the scenes of the vibrant marketplace and gestured to the buildings along the east side of the Eastern Plaza. This is the school that you were referring to? Freyan asked. That's right, Clara smiled. I thought we would have had to return in the morning, Freyan said, but it looks just as active as the rest of the plaza. She couldn't see through the walls, but the windows were brightly lit and plenty of movement could be seen within. School, be it Temple School, a workshop filled with apprentices, or the Imperial Magic Academy, usually ended by mid-afternoon. Classes are busiest at this time of day, Clara told her. Curious, Freyan looked up at the rows of windows. Why is that? It's as I said, is it not? Clara replied, if there is no equity in education, then there is no equity of opportunity. I have no intention of leaving anyone behind,